There we go. Okay, we are live now. Hi everyone. Thank you all for coming to round two of our class. Slightly better technical setup. Now we've got a rubber band and a tripod, whereas before we had a stack of books or a laptop or something. So as you can see, we've got some forward momentum going on here. It's actually a pretty good day for optimism. I know, sometimes whenever I start these things, whether it's here or on a Saturday deployment or something, it sounds like a lot of doom and gloom. But honestly, I think today the world saw some glimmer of hope in an international peace coalition call that we had today. And before I talk about that, I want to contextualize it. Yesterday, there were unconfirmed reports, and I still don't know if this is confirmed or not, that Shoigu, in representing Putin, delivered a letter to the new president of Iran. Basically, the letter detailed that Iran should not retaliate against its strikes that Israel had done on Iran. In other words, this is Putin telling the new president of Iran, don't start World War III, and that Putin himself will mediate and negotiate between the two countries. I hope this is true. And I said this on RT. I was interviewed by RT the other day. I was asked, I brought this up. I also said the same thing on their platform. I hope this is true. Because if this is true, this may be a way in which we avert World War III for now. And you have to think about the irony of it, because Putin has just been invaded by Ukraine. There are now Ukrainian soldiers in Russia. There are now attacks in Russia. So Putin saying to Iran, don't retaliate. What is actually going on here? And this is something that was discussed today, this morning, at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in New York. We had over 500 people on a Zoom call to listen to people like Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Larry Wilkerson, Dennis Kucinich, Ray McGovern, and a handful of other people. And of course, my friend J.R. Heffelfinger, who is the director of the 8/15 Hiroshima movie. And Larry Wilkerson gave just a rousing talk where at first he laid out the desperation of the situation, how bleak it all looked, how close we are to thermonuclear war. And then he says, but there is hope. There is some form of inspiration, and it takes the people taking back their republic or taking back their government, as I've been saying before. And then Dennis Kucinich reiterated this idea where he explicitly said, yes, I agree with the idea that we need to beat our swords into plowshares. And what that idea refers to is that we have over 800 military bases around the world. We have all of these companies and manufacturing plants that make weapons and jet fighters and parts for war that could be retooled to manufacture things like high-speed rail or agricultural tools, or become research centers to develop technologies that will help humanity moving forward. That's the point where we are now, where we can either choose to continue our plunge into World War III and end in a fiery nuclear explosion, or we can choose the mercy principle. We can choose the clemency principle, a non-aggression principle where we don't strike back and we have talks, we have negotiations. It's not going to be easy, but I think everyone should learn from the example that if this is true, that Putin has asked the president of Iran not to strike back, that he is taking the mercy principle. Everyone should be taking this principle right now. And the people in this room, the people in the Bronx, and the people around the country should be supporting everything they can to make sure that there are no more retaliations, no more killings, and no more death. And it begins here in this class, coming off the heels of this 11 in the morning IPC call, which I heard there will be videos of later today. People can hear the various speeches. I had addressed it as well. I had a little back and forth with Ray McGovern and Helga Zepp-LaRouche. And I don't want to take up your time any further. So today is class 2, and it will be led by Megan DeBroat. Megan DeBroat is a longtime collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche, and she is the president. Can I say that? Yeah, right. She is the president of the Schiller Institute here in the United States. And everything I know and everything I am is actually because of her. I say this to a lot of people. When people ask me who I am and what I am, I always say it's the organization. But Megan is the one who actually taught me how to use the monochords, who taught me the Kepler, who worked with me, who made my head hurt many times. And I'm really proud to be introducing her here. I was 15 years old when I first met her, and now I'm 25, and now she's got 2 kids. And anyway, Megan, come on up. Yeah.
Introduction. All right. So what we have to do today is kick off a series of classes on Lyndon LaRouche's Science of Physical Economy. And I will assert that the discoveries that Lyndon LaRouche made in the late 1940s and early 1950s, founding economics as a branch of physical science, was the single most important discovery in the lifetime of anybody alive today. Probably the single most important discovery in the past 100 years, and quite possibly the single most important discovery in human history. The hope of the class series that we are going to unfold is to hopefully communicate to all of you LaRouche's discoveries, those principles, knowable principles of physical economy, the basis of economic policy making here and everywhere. If we do that, I'm absolutely convinced that we can unleash the greatest good to ever befall mankind in human history. And from that standpoint, I think we're all very lucky to be alive today, even given the tension of that statement with what Jose just said, that we are a hair trigger, if that, away from the unleashing of the destruction of all humankind and everything, all of the beautiful things that's produced. So I think we have to sit with that tension, the potential of what this moment in history is. So I want to start with this on the subject of economics, that there's a kind of funny idea which pervades the minds of probably most people in society, certainly in the West, maybe more broadly, that there will always be poverty, that there's always going to be some poor people somewhere, right? Maybe in the Bronx, the poor people in the Bronx, maybe in some inner city somewhere else around the world, the kind of rural poverty you run into even here in the United States, Burundi, some other nation on the continent of Africa. Somewhere there's always going to be some poor people. That's just the way it works. This is something that Lyndon LaRouche had a very visceral, face-to-face experience with when he was a young man, serving in World War II in the Burma Theater in 1946. He was stationed in a transport depot in India, waiting to be sent back to the United States at the end of the war. And the deep and horrifying poverty that he saw in India, the crown jewel of the British Empire at the time, right? And the treatment of the population by the British soldiers absolutely convinced LaRouche that poverty was the deepest evil, not of human nature, but of the system of empire. This was an outgrowth of a disease we call the empire system. Today you might call it the NATO system, which has held back, which has suppressed the natural activity of the human species. The kind of activity that, if not for that empire system, would have created today the kind of accelerating growth and development all around the world, such that we should have not 8 billion people on the planet, right? 2 billion of which, just to mention, have no access to clean water. That's probably a conservative figure. Not 8 billion, we should have tens of billions, approaching 100 billion people living on the planet today, living longer, happier, healthier lives at a higher standard of living than we could possibly afford today. That's what should be. Now, I'm going to ask Jose to pull up the first slide here. There we go. So this, as opposed to the evil of empire, this is an artifact of the goodness of humankind. So this is a graph of the human population growth in millions of people over the past 100,000 years. It has a very distinct shape, you might notice, right? No animal species has a population curve like this. No animal species could ever have a population curve like this. If human beings were just another species of ape, just if we were just some clever monkeys, there could be maximum around 10 or so million people on the planet today. Today we're topping 8 billion. So why? When it comes down to it, fundamentally, what's responsible for that difference? So we're going to hear in this video, we're going to hear from Lyndon LaRouche on that.
Can you
The root of an economy is man. There's no economy among animals. An economy reflects a characteristic of people, of the human individual, the difference between the individual and the beast. That is, these cognitive powers by which we discover universal physical principles, derive new technologies or apply technology based on these principles. We apply them to our problems. And therefore we find that through our efforts, our physical efforts, or the expenditure of our time, that we are able to produce more wealth than it costs to keep us in the process of production, both in terms of our labor, in terms of the cost to maintain the families in which we come, but also in the cost to society of capital expenditures on which we rely, both in private industry and by government, including large-scale infrastructure, things of that sort. We rely upon this. Our productivity depends upon it. And therefore, it is the power of man to make discoveries and to use them. Discoveries derived from discovery of universal physical principles, which increases the value of what is produced over the cost of production.
What LaRouche just said, that through discoveries that occur in the human mind and the technologies through which we apply those discoveries, we can change nature to increase the value of what we produce over the cost of what it took to produce that in physical terms. It's an anti-entropic process that LaRouche discovered. Now, in future classes, we're going to go into the fact that producing more than you consume is only possible if you apply higher and higher technologies, which represent higher and higher applications of energy flux density at the point of production, represented, for example, in technologies like that of nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. That if you do that, as opposed to what's said today, which is we have to reduce our consumption, if instead you do what LaRouche is talking about, you actually accelerate and raise the consumption per capita in your society. But you do it in a way that actually produces even more than is consumed. And that's the magic, you could say, of human activity. That's the miracle that we see measured in physical economy. So this raises a related issue, one which is central to LaRouche's discovery, which I'm going to pose in the form of a question for people to think about, and that's this. Is there a limit to that process just described? Is there a limit to the population curve? Is there a limit to human consumption? Posed a little bit differently, can human progress be perpetual? Can it continue infinitely into the future? If the answer to that is yes, what are the implications of that for us today? Us, we mortal creatures. What does that imply about how we ought to shape our behavior? Now, another way to ask that question, or to ask a related question, is what's the relationship between actual human nature, as opposed to the British Empire view, actual human nature and economics? So to begin to answer that, I want to turn just for a moment to the work of someone who may or may not be familiar to you, and that is Vladimir Vernadsky. Has anyone heard of Vladimir Vernadsky? Maybe some people who have read LaRouche might be familiar. Vernadsky, he was born in 1863, died in 1945. He was a Russian biogeochemist. And though he didn't invent the terms, he really founded the science of the biosphere and the noosphere. And and I'll say the reason I bring him up is, hopefully you'll get a sense of it, LaRouche found that Vernadsky's work resonated strongly with his own discoveries in economics. So in 1945, which remember, Vernadsky was living in Russia in 1945 at the end of World War II, so you can imagine what he was surrounded by. But in a short writing called Some Words About the Noosphere, Vernadsky writes this: "Here, a new riddle has arisen before us. Thought is not a form of energy. How then can it change material processes?" So thought is not a form of energy. How can it change material processes? What's that mystery? And though he didn't express it in these terms, that is exactly the subject of physical economy. So Vernadsky asserted that if you want to know about life on Earth, if you want to study life on Earth, don't ask what life is. Ask what life does. So Vernadsky studied the evolution and the resulting chemistry of the Earth in terms of the impact of the development of life first, and then the development of specifically human life, characterized by the power of reason. And what Vernadsky concluded is that through the existence of the planet, going back at least, I think now we confirm that life is at least 3.7 billion years old, that we keep finding earlier and earlier fossils. Through those 3.7 billion years, the activity of life has radically altered the non-living chemistry and geology of the planet. It's created new chemical compounds that could not have existed without the activity of life, new structures. It's taken over more and more the non-living territory, you might say, of the Earth's crust as it evolved. And it's been doing that at an accelerating rate, to the point that there is virtually no quote unquote natural space that's untouched by the activity of life, including our atmosphere, which, thanks to some little bacteria a few billion years ago, created an oxygen atmosphere, which we luckily breathe today. So Vernadsky observed that just as life took over the non-living, changed its chemistry, raised it to a level of higher energy potential, human species does the same thing in our activity as a whole over the face of the planet. The difference is we don't change the planet primarily through our biology. Our little bodies, we don't do too much with the activity of our biological processes. Through technology, which is a fossil of the mind, human activity has overtaken the rate of change of biotic activity in terms terms of our impact on reshaping the planet. Vernadsky, as opposed to the typical greenie outlook today, or the anti-human branch of greenie outlook today, Vernadsky saw that as a lawful and most natural outgrowth of natural processes. He says human activity is an extension or a new phase of the anti-anthropic development of the earth. Now, that fact, which goes along with what I raised a few moments ago, the question of perpetual progress, that, LaRouche asserts, is not only possible for mankind, but that's actually the natural state of mankind. And that raises the most fundamental consideration of physical economy, which is, what is the human species? What are we? What principle do we embody? What is the precise nature of that creative capacity that you think about this miracle, that human beings are able to imagine, to think within the sovereign bounds of their mind, never before thoughts, some of which correspond so closely to actual principles that run the universe, that we're able to exert power over that universe. We're able to become masters of those natural processes. How incredible. What is the human mind in that sense? The beautiful thing about physical economy is that with LaRouche's physical economics, what we're looking at is we're measuring the progress of the development of human creativity and our mastery over nature in terms of the way in which human beings are rewarded when we discover new principles by being able to raise the human population and the standard of living at the same time. That's beautiful. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to close this part of it with a longer quotation from a 1984 paper by LaRouche, which I know some of us in the room recently read, called The Science of the Human Mind. Can you pull that up, Jose? I'll skip. There we go. Why don't I read it, and then we can always go back and reread parts of it if we'd like to. So LaRouche says, the existence of mankind depends upon increase of the potential relative population density of mankind. This indispensable increase is fostered in turn by a rather well-defined pathway of development of human mental life. Although the immediate benefits of such practice are purely and simply material benefits in one respect, they are not merely material benefits. We have shown that our universe is ordered in a certain way, and that by advancing man's willful practice toward increasing agreement with the Logos, man participates in the work of the Creator. The advancement of potential relative population density, because of the means by which this can be sustained as continuing practice, not only affords mankind material benefits, but obliges man to develop himself toward perfecting agreement with the Logos as the means for achieving that material progress. Material progress becomes thus not the goal achieved by development of the mind, but the means by which we oblige ourselves to develop the mind into increasing agreement with the Logos. The aggregate work of humanity, if humanity is so governed in its practice, unquestionably contributes to some larger end in the universe itself. I'm just going to read that sentence again. The aggregate work of humanity, if humanity is so governed in its practice, unquestionably contributes to some larger end in the universe itself. Our development toward increasing agreement with the Logos is a sufficient statement of our goal, a sufficient definition of the good. Our immediate practical concern in committing ourselves to developing the good within us is to contribute to making society good. The individual who contributes to making society good is worth 1,000 times the individual who wanders through life scattering only individual good deeds. For a bad society will crush the good contributed by its individual members and will foster the pleasures of Sodom and Gomorrah. Who makes society good, thus preserves the goods contributed by thousands and millions of individuals. Now, that's the goal of an economy. And that's our mission. That's the mission of this campaign. That's what any even moderately sane elected official, policymaker would be striving to do. How can we bring our policy and our dialogue over policy in line with what can be proven to be natural law? So let your imagination wander for a moment and think, what if every nation on the planet had that as its standard of economic policy making? What would be the outcome? So that's our mission. That's our mission, is how is today, in this incredible moment of breakdown, which ironically, it is only moments this perilous, moments which are this perilous, in which you can make the kinds of overall changes to the entire system that have to be made before it's too late. How can we make sure that the new system that comes into existence, if there is to be one, is based on the knowledge given to us by Lyndon LaRouche and his discoveries in economics? So that's what I wanted to put out, and just to give a little preview of what's to come in the next weeks, what we're going to cover. This a term you heard LaRouche mention in this quote from The Science of the Human Mind, potential relative population density, why that is the correct measure of the success or failure of an economy. The role of money. What is money? Right? A lot of people want money. What is the lawful role of money in an economy? And more than that, what is credit? Which LaRouche said that's the principle of Hamiltonian, Alexander Hamilton's credit system. That's actually the only way you can give value to so-called money. Energy flux density. Why is it necessary to go to higher and higher levels of energy flux density if you want perpetual economic and technological progress? The role of culture, and that's really the big question, the role of culture. LaRouche sort of addressed that, I think, in this last quote. How do we, imagine your neighbors, your politicians, your people you know, people you pass in the street, how can we actually make the people in society good, beautiful people, such that they too take it on as their mission to perpetuate the good in society, to do the good. So the issue of culture really is the overarching generator of new discoveries and the kind of emotional content that's necessary to make new discoveries. So that's the idea. That's what I wanted to put on the table. So we have discussion of that. Anything brought up here, anything more broadly? Jose wants to come out to answer questions.
Are you taking questions?
Yeah. Yes.
Does anyone have a question?
Or thoughts?
I have a question, but I don't want to hog up the room.
Go for it.
So, first of all, in understanding potential population density, does that mean that a higher population means that the society is good or is in a good direction?
So we'll get more into this, but LaRouche defines potential relative population density as the measurement of economic progress or decay. So what you want to look at is how, given a certain area, which has a certain land area, which has a certain quality, be it desert, tundra, temperate, so forth. And given the level of technological achievement of that society, if that technology were applied in that land area, how many people could be supported within a given land area. But what LaRouche says is you don't just want to measure that population density per se. What you want to look at is what's the change in population density? Is the potential population density increasing? Is the rate of increase of potential population density increasing?
Well, the reason I brought that up is because often, neoconservatives and Malthusians like to say, well, third world countries have a skyrocketing population and their living standards are terrible. But
so you get to a point, and I would say, are maybe nearing that point. I don't know exactly how near. Maybe we've passed it in the U.S. where the actual population is above the potential population density. And in that case, you get a population collapse, right?
Well, but then how did it do that? How did we get above that?
How did the population get above that?
Yeah.
Well, think about the infrastructure systems or lack thereof in nations that have been kept in poverty. Think about the all of the things that would go into providing a good standard of living for people that have been denied them. Right? So given a certain natural population growth, when you surpass the applied ability to support that population, you get collapse, you get conditions of poverty, and so forth and so on. But what LaRouche is looking at, though, is if we applied our knowledge to this area, how many new minds could we support? And do we have a culture that's actually creating people that can make the next discovery, right, to increase that rate of growth?
But then these things have to be measured over a period of time.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm sorry. Does anyone else have any other questions or thoughts?
I do. Now, over time, it seems that a lot of our industry has been shipped overseas or has been downsized. We don't have the manufacturing capabilities that we used to have. And that is really shown during the COVID epidemic or pandemic 4 years ago, where we couldn't even produce something as simple as masks. Also, we have the shutdown of the Indian Point nuclear plant, and a lot of nuclear plants since we got spooked about nuclear in 1979, following the 3 Mile Island incident. So, it seems like, Megan, is it the case that it seems like not only has the U.S. population surpassed this potential relative population density, but the relative potential population density has actually gone down?
I don't know if it's gone down, and I should kind of back on what I said. I mean, you look at the United States, and you look at how empty most of our country is, how undeveloped most of our land is. The U.S. population, the actual population here, hasn't surpassed it, though maybe our willingness to support the population has collapsed, right? But in terms of what you're bringing up, yeah, about the change, the economic change that started to happen with so-called globalization and the outsourcing and the shift of the United States. Now we've industrialized, and now we're going to move on to the next phase of becoming a consumer economy, where our number one product is financial products, right? And so we sold out all of our machine tools, we shipped all of our manufacturing overseas, which turned a monetary profit for those corporations, and then more than that for those speculators on Wall Street, but increased the physical cost of producing the same good. And that's the irony of it. So you take a factory in the United States at a time when we actually had good functioning infrastructure systems, transportation, electricity, water transport, and so forth, and you had an integration of the agro-industrial economy here, a strong integration. Compare that to taking that same manufacturing plant and putting it in a place like Mexico, Thailand, wherever these things were moved, where you have a relatively much lower level of infrastructure development, education of the population, and so forth and so on. The physical cost of producing the same good is now much, much higher, but it's papered over by a monetary fraud. Right? So this is the kind of primitive accumulation, stealing from the population and turning that into a so-called monetary profit. And that's what's been done.
The Wall Street stocks go up, and the price we pay as consumers at the store goes up, and our standard of living is lowered.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on your discussion of Vernadsky, because I was thinking about his discoveries in the domain of life in relation to this environmentalist concept that there's a balance of nature. You can't change nature because it remains the same. But if you look at his studies and what he did with the concept of life, I mean, you look at photosynthesis, for example, right? That wasn't something that was existing in nature at the time. That was, I guess you could call it a technological development of life, for lack of terms, because the atmosphere at that time consisted mostly of carbon dioxide. And then you have this introduction of oxygen, in which the species at that time, which mostly ran on carbon dioxide, they became extinct. And then you had a new form of life which developed at that point. So, I mean, it just shows you that life is constantly evolving. And humanity, in replicating that kind of development, needs to go in that direction as well. And also, because Lynn always discussed this concept of the distinction between the beast and humanity. And, you know, life goes through developments like humanity does, but I think the difference is that humanity is able to willfully, in an instant, choose to develop. We can choose to go to fusion, for example. We can choose that. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's it. And so in the biosphere, this progress over time has happened in the changeover of species. You were mentioning this great oxygenation crisis when some of these little single-celled organisms produced all this oxygen, pumped out all this oxygen, and basically wiped out 90% of the species on Earth, right? But what came out of it was a higher order system, right? Organisms that could metabolize oxygen. This led to multicellular life. Thank God we're here, right? But that happens through the extinction of one set, you could say, of species and the rise of another set of species. As you referenced, we don't have to do that. We don't have to physically go extinct. What goes extinct are old ideas. And what comes into being are new ideas. At one point, I forget what period, but LaRouche would sometimes reference this, reference that idea as human beings having super genes, right? We evolve without having to physically evolve. The evolution is the way. And the really fascinating thing about the Science of the Human Mind paper that I read the quotation from is LaRouche really zeroes in on what was his passionate investigation throughout his whole life, which is what is that nature of, what is the ordered nature of human creativity? It's not like, I mean, creativity is such a messed up term in today's society. You know, it's like you go to the Guggenheim, right, or whatever, you go to these modern art museums and you see this like smear on the wall or like some kind of feces, you know, smeared on the wall, and that's creativity. Doing something that's so crazy that nobody could have possibly ever thought of it before, that sort of thing. LaRouche observed that there seemed to be if you look throughout the history of human thought, there seems to be an ordering in the set of discoveries that's contributed to human progress. And over time, you have people who have seen themselves in the lineage of these great thinkers contributing to the progress of human thought overall in a certain direction. And he was fascinated with investigating what is that. In this paper he referenced there, he uses Plato's term, the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. What is that continuing process of progress through all the discontinuous states of the human species as defined by our set of knowledge, our beliefs about the principles of the universe. So I think that's a totally fascinating investigation. Yeah, and that's what Vernadsky was trying to dig into and figure out in the science of the noosphere.
We have a few comments here from YouTube. This was actually from Roman in North Carolina. He's posing here as his podcast, Philosophism, which
people who are interested, I did an episode with Roman. You should check it out on his YouTube channel. But he left some comments here as if he was here in person that he wanted to share with you. I just put it up on the screen there. To me, that is very fascinating. And I think what that refers to is when you were breaking down the quote unquote cost of what it makes to produce something, and how, it might be cheaper on a monetary sense, but the physical cost to produce something is much greater. And so he said that, to me, that is very fascinating, because earlier I was explaining why I do not think that GDP is an accurate measure of economic development, since GDP measures market value. A society of overly priced but useless goods or expensive goods that reflect social bads, like more spending on cleanup and more spending on lawyers for frivolous lawsuits, would have a higher aggregate spending and a higher GDP. Conversely, a society that produces the same good but for a cheaper price on the market would have a lower GDP than one which produces the same goods and sells them for a higher cost. OMG, thank you. I didn't know anyone would read the chat.
Or take what the European Union did a few years ago, which is to bring drugs and prostitution as categories that can be measured with GDP, right?
Yep.
Our GDP is not high enough. Let's bring that in, right? No, exactly.
Go. Don't be shy. It's like you twitch your lip like you're going to say something. Oh.
No.
Okay, sorry.
I'll ask a question. I mean, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Megan. I mean, the irony that you're posing about the crisis that we're going through, I think implicitly and also in Jose's briefing, it's about the crisis of particularly politics in the United States. Obviously, it doesn't all reduce down to the United States, but there is a crisis, particularly of the U.S. presidency, that there isn't really an executive function that is operative in the United States, which is, exemplified by the speech that Netanyahu gave at the Congress. That sort of farce of a, shadow of an evil president. But you mentioned primitive accumulation and this idea, that we are essentially being robbed by a kind of criminal group of people that are, posing as our government essentially, or manipulating our government, or however you want to put it. But you didn't say anything about class warfare or class struggle, or this kind of Marxist idea of a sort of inevitable clash of classes. And I think that for people coming from a leftist perspective, it would be a conspicuous lack of in what you said. And I'm curious to hear you comment on how LaRouche's political philosophy addresses the question of how we are to change these things.
I think the main point is that human history is made by fundamental discoveries of the human mind, which are in line with the lawful principles of the universe. That's what changes history. That's what causes a change in history. It's the leadership that comes from that, combined with, I don't know if that's the right phrase, but with the kind of passion and love for mankind that motivated people like Joan of Arc, like Lincoln, like many others to risk their lives if it came down to it. And it did for many of them. To demonstrate a principle of humanity. That's what changes history. And the fact that when you act on principles such as that, which are in line with natural law, that's power. It's not the aggregation of the masses, so to speak. I don't know that's not what you're saying, but that's power. LaRouche sometimes referenced the weak forces. When you the minority or the one person acting on a principle of truth actually exerts power in the universe. So it's not a direct answer for the terms you posed it, but I know that's one of the ways that LaRouche discussed it often, and I think also demonstrated with the way he lived his life. And I'll also say it was also demonstrated in the fact that the American Republic won its independence from the greatest empire on earth.
Yep.
So how were we able to do that?
Something about taxes, right?
Yeah.
Jose mentioned that you taught him Kepler and the monochord. I don't know if everybody knows here what a monochord is, but I thought, like, what is the relation between the two things Jose mentioned and economy? And also because in those days, when you go to school or university, people just say, you know, we have natural sciences and we have art, and you're more that kind of guy, and you're that kind of guy. And he mentioned both in one sentence. Could you explain that and the relation to economy?
Do you want to say anything first?
No, it's my little control panel.
Well, if you sit, then you can be in the frame with Megan.
Is that better? So you asked me why I mentioned the Kepler and monochord. Johannes Kepler was an astronomer for the 15th century, right? That bled into the 16th century. Yeah, that's what I said. 16th to the 17th century. And when I was a teenager, Megan was leading a class on the harmony of the world. So some of us would get together and we would read through this book that Johannes Kepler wrote called The Harmony of the World. And this was at a point in human history, right? It's only like 500 years ago when we were still asking the question, does the sun rotate around the earth or does the earth rotate around the sun? You know, the axiom at the time was that the sun was rotating around the earth and that it was completely ridiculous to assume otherwise. But Kepler didn't necessarily care about the hows, but more about the whys, right? Why would the sun rotate around the earth, or why would the earth rotate around the sun? And in that investigation, he figured out the hows. And he had discovered a relationship between the scales, the musical scales that we have today, and the distances of the planets. It's like, well, wait a minute. How? And why? What is this relationship that exists in music and the way in which our universe is structured and our solar system is structured? And there were all these hypotheses that Kepler had about, you know, what he thought might have been the way in which the solar system was constructed. A lot of it was wrong, but what we were doing is we were going and tracing his steps, you know, trying to basically figure it out with him. So it wasn't necessarily that he was right in everything he was doing. It's not a waste of time to look at the way he was thinking. It's about how do you actually make a discovery that's so profound. And I think the conclusion of that book is that he discovers that there's something called gravity, right? Or at least that's like the beginnings of the understanding of a force called gravity. Am I right about that? That's like the kind of kicker of the end of the book there. But I'm not giving the Kepler class, all right? So don't. But overall, like I'm studying this when I'm 15, 16, 17. You can understand how the solar system works and the relationship through a monochord, which is just a single stringed instrument. You know, guitar has 6 strings, a monochord has 1. But you can divide it in ways that give you different pitches. So if you cut it in half, that's an octave. And then the different ratios give you different notes up until you have the entire scale, or of a C major scale. So it's kind of interesting, actually, that you can just through a simple monochord understand how the solar system is organized. So, do you want to take this question?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't know if it was on.
I'll just add one thing to that. Is that in terms of culture, because Madeleine, you're referencing the division that's made between the sciencey people and the musicy people or the artsy people, which is a really false distinction. If you have a completely new thought, completely new discovery. You can't just turn to somebody and go, gravity, right? Right?
Yeah.
You have to somehow cause another person to recreate that discovery within their own minds. That's the only way you've ever come to know something. And the challenge is, how do you get another person to think the very specific brand new thought that you just thought? That's the function of poetry. And you take a poem or a joke, which is like a poem,
Yeah.
and if you try to explain the poem or explain why the joke is funny, you've just killed the poem. You kill it. It's no longer a poem. It is no longer funny, right? There's a kind of communication between human beings that is possible and only possible beyond words. Doesn't mean it's not precise, but it's beyond the reach of words. That's the domain of art, and that's also the domain of the imagination is also the domain of where discoveries are to be made. And that was known by the greatest thinkers, Einstein, Kepler, Max Planck, right? These people were all musicians of one sort or another, or poets. So that's what I know.
Right before you spoke about gravity, I think you were mentioning something about how, like, the catalyst behind, like, what makes somebody go that deeply and discover something profound. Is there like a direct answer to that, like something innate that a person can like use as a catalyst to make discoveries like that?
Start to work on it. You know, you see it in children when they figure something out. They laugh, right? They get happy. You know, often in our educational system, that kind of joy is stamped out pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're working on a problem and you figure something out, you figure out how to do something, you get happy. You know, LaRouche has said many times in the way we've organized our own educational process in this movement is rework, right? Jose was referencing reading back through this thick book of Kepler's. Rework the greatest discoveries of the past. Know them for yourself. Or like, for example, the Pythagorean theorem. Who knows that that's a squared plus b squared equals c squared? Who knows that that's true? Who's figured it out? You haven't, try, right? When you figure it out, you'll get really happy. It's that kind of passion that actually drives you forward, right? You don't want to lose that kind of happiness as opposed to the really silly pleasures that you might get from whatever's available in our culture today. They really pale in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, the Greeks used to compare doing geometry and figuring out geometric problems to drinking nectar, like just having like a boys' night, basically.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people in our society today have been conditioned to be anti-discovery or anti-thinking. Like there's a certain frustration when it comes to, oh, I have to figure out something that I don't know how to do. You know, I'm just not going to do it. Or I think we're used to a culture now where we can just Google things and the answer's immediately available.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a frustration in, I don't know, you can do this experiment where if you try to get somebody to double the square, I mean, count how many times they try to give up before you have to egg them on to actually finish it. And then when they get it, it's that, you know, and I mean, I've had that happen many times. And yes, madam.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is actually on purpose, I think. The kind of re-education of not making discoveries because it's innate. Making like small kids, you know, they want to discover the world and they want to understand it, and they ask a lot of stupid questions where you think, oh, why should I know why the sky is blue? You know, that kind of thing, but it's very natural. And then you go through this educational system where people maybe are just trained to act like robots and not actually question what is going on this planet. So I think it's a very willful destruction of the cognitive capacities of young people.
Robot.
Any other questions for Megan? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think you guys kind of answered it already. But back to what you said about like poetry and how it relates to a joke and how sometimes when you get it, if you have to explain it, then it kind of defeats it. But like, what if the person is in need of an explanation, or like, what if that can be their catalyst? Like, how do you go about that without, I don't know, sounding pretentious or like?
How do you explain a joke to somebody?
Well, I was saying more in terms of like poetry. I think a lot of people aren't into poetry.
Yeah.
And I was myself included, because like sometimes like even Robert or like Jose will quote a poem and I'm like, wow, this must be powerful because they know it by memory. And then I'd be like, wow, but not really understanding.
I mean, other people have experience with poetry and should speak up. I mean, I think two things. One, these poets wrote to a culture which was a higher culture than ours. People who are a more educated culture than ours, many of them. But I think more than that, I mean, poems, you're not necessarily going to get it on the first read. It takes work. It takes some work, I think, to get inside of it. And it's the same thing with a discovery, or even a simple geometric problem. When you just look at it, you don't necessarily get it on first blush. You actually have to get inside of it, and to the point that you know the inside of the poem, such that it's yours now. You get it now, and such that you can then recite the poem as if those were the words you would have chosen to express the idea. It's the same thing with a musical composition too. We're given these notes on a page as musicians, and we have to learn the notes and rehearse it and get it, but you want to get it to the point that you have that passionate poetic idea such that these are the notes you would have played to express it.
Yeah, I think especially with a poem, because what's so great about a poem is that its ambiguity allows you to revisit it over and over and over again, especially if you make it personal. It means something different at every stage in your life, and it'll mean something different to the people you recite it to. And if that means you have to recite it over and over and over again until they get it, fine. A lot of the problem too is the fact that people don't know how to properly recite poetry too. There used to be a time when people would recite poetry and practice for it as if they were practicing to sing a song or a piece of music. And it kind of sucks if somebody's reciting to you, stopping by the woods on a snowy evening, and they just said, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though he will not see me stop here to watch his woods filled with snow. It's kind of boring. But, if you ask like a Michelle Aaron to, recite something to you, she'll give you her best rendition of it, and you'll get something out of it. And I picked that poem in particular, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, because that's when I think anybody who wants to be an organizer should make that theirs, And I'll stop there.
I have another question, more specifically about Kepler. I know you mentioned that a lot of these great scientific minds that discovered came from other backgrounds like poetry and musicians. Do you know if a lot of them were personally very deeply religious, and if that played a role in how they went about going their discoveries?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Kepler was training to be a theologian before he was whisked away to become a mathematics teacher, which kind of changed the specific course of his life. He was deeply religious. Einstein was deeply religious.
That's the most fascinating part. I didn't mean to interrupt, but yeah, I mean, reading through Kepler's Astronomia Nova, it's fascinating work in terms of the actual concrete discovery of physical principle that is made. That I, to the extent that I saw that, but the thing that is actually really fascinating to that book, in that book to me, was that you see that he has a rigorous scientific mission that he is driven internally. It's not for a school, it's not for a degree. it's documented as if it were the course of his own life, and it is a religious mission, but it's not about proselytizing someone to take on the same concept of God that he has, but just that he has a rigorous conception of what this creator must be if what he is discovering is valid scientifically, and it's all he writes poetry, he writes prose, he writes jokes, he has these descriptions, and he has really rigorous math, and it's all very I think it is all very much subsumed under a kind of search for God. Not that it reduces to that, and I think that goes to what Madeline was saying, whether or not every single textbook that's being used in America was specifically designed to, make people act like robots. I mean, the overarching concept of science is one that is somehow supposed to be antithetical to the notion of a creative principle in the universe. That in order to become educated, we have to kind of, if we want to learn science, we have to become antagonistic to a creative concept of the universe.
So I think these guys have proved that it's not antagonistic. It's kind of like meshes together, like what you're saying. It's like the scientific principles and the religious principles, that they kind of mesh together because of their search for that understanding led to their actual discoveries, like on Earth, like in practical scientific terms. Should you say it like in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the intention to discover, I don't think that can really come about from a mechanistic worldview.
Just to add to that, it's kind of, you really get the sense of the unity between science and theology. If you look at some of the sermons from the older founders of Christianity, particularly St. Ambrose, he was the teacher of St. Augustine, and Augustine's thought is very influential in Western European thought. But Ambrose, when he was delivering sermons, he would talk about things like astronomy. He would talk about philosophy. And that's something you definitely don't see if you go to a sermon today. It's just all this fanatical, proselytizing. And yeah, I mean, religion has certainly degenerated in that sense, where it's just about preaching, and, not really giving people an idea on how to discover the God and how to discover the way that he created the universe. And that's, I think, what motivated Kepler in that respect, his belief in God and discovering God's thought through astronomy.
Lucia's joke about the Baptist preacher who dies, and they're going through all his things after he dies, and they find his Bible and they open it, and in the margin he wrote, "Meaning unclear." Shout louder.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You use the term anti-entropic when talking about like human economy, and I think you were saying that like the LaRouche kind of perspective on the capacity for more growth and kind of a more optimistic outlook about things was anti-entropic. Would you mind like elaborating on what you mean when you said that?
Yeah, well, so that LaRouche was, I think the reason the way he came to choose that term as opposed to others you may think of, so he was prompted to do the work that led to his discovery when he got a pre-publication copy of Norbert Wiener's Cybernetics, in I think it was 1947 or 8, and at first he was fascinated. He was fascinated by computers, which were kind of just coming into being in a real way. but when he started reading it, he got completely enraged because the idea that all biological and human communication can be reduced to a set of linear systems, right? He just knew it was absolutely untrue. And then the further implications of that by John von Neumann and the human use of human beings and all sorts of things like that. But LaRouche borrowed the language of thermodynamics, which also I think he's not the only one to do that, but he borrowed the language of thermodynamics to describe economic systems. But rather than the idea of the system running down because all the energy of the system is consumed or lost to friction or whatnot, what LaRouche was describing as a successful economic process is one in which the input to the capital, capital intensity, or he used the term capital intensity, the input to the productive part of the economy is growing over time at the same time that the output is growing over time, but at a faster rate. So the free energy of the system, right, what's left over after we account for all the physical costs of production, is increasing over time and at a faster rate, even though the energy of the system is itself growing because we're going to higher and higher levels of technology which require more and more physical consumption to keep them in the process of production. So that's kind of the language he landed on, and he said this as opposed to what's been done with the second law of thermodynamics, which is to take something which might be applicable to a closed system of a heat-powered machine and to say that the whole universe runs that way, and the whole universe is going to run down. He's actively campaigning against that idea, to say the universe is developing. The activity of mankind is a subset of that, and we see that in human economic activity. So human systems, the universe itself, are not entropic. And at first he chose the term negentropic, and then he said no, it's anti-entropic. It's producing more, it's growing, it's developing.
It's also interesting that there's a really huge AI company. They call it Anthropic. So like they do like language models and stuff like that. So that's probably where they got you can connect the dots to where they got the name. That's pretty cool. I just thought it was interesting. Just first I heard about it.
Being told I should smile more.
I'll ask another question if you don't mind. You mentioned in passing the Hamiltonian credit system, and in the class last week, I tried to sort of briefly touch on Alan Salisbury's historical work in kind of demonstrating how the American system of political economy was kind of suppressed and taken over throughout the course of the 19th century. But now that we have gone through more of a discussion of LaRouche's ideas, and particularly this most recent question about anti-entropy, I'm wondering if you would go through a little bit in a little bit more depth what the credit system is for people who don't know versus what we have today.
Yeah, I can say a few things, although I'll say it's been too long since I've read Hamilton. But today, what is the concept of money? What do you guys think? The concept of, I would say today, let me back up. I would say today people equate credit and money, right, for the most part.
What do you mean?
I don't think there's really a difference in the common belief between credit and money, except the credit is the money that you borrow, right?
Well, I have a lot of it, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But what is money?
Exchange of value, but something that guarantees exchange of value.
Okay. So what's value then? What is?
Whatever is valuable, like goods and services, like in society.
Okay. So So what is money used to measure? We sure measure a lot of things in money, don't we?
Yeah.
Sure.
Why? Or like, how is that supposed to be reflective of
Well,
something?
It's reflective of those, it's a measurement of those goods and values, right? So maybe we should ask ourselves why we value those things the way we do, maybe, because I don't know if there's a reason behind it. Like I'm just thinking about right now where we have like luxury items, and in terms of like actual utility, because you know like there's only a few factories that make all this stuff, and then they just have a different logo on them, so you can just get it from somebody else that doesn't have the Gucci
Prices
logo.
are overinflated.
Exactly, the prices are overinflated, but it's the same exact product. It just has a different logo on it. But we are in a way saying that this has like $3,000 more value than the other one, even though like physically it's the same thing, it's the same utility.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so we want to actually get into measuring the real, the actual value of something versus the nominal value, right? Is that, would that be accurate to what you're saying? So one thing that is difficult to measure in money is something that doesn't yet exist, right? It's kind of, it's hard to buy and sell something which doesn't yet exist. As in, the kind of investment that we might make into bringing a fission and fusion economy into being. There's a value that will come about, that exists in the future, that will come about, and can provably come about, which doesn't quote unquote yet exist in the system. That hypothesis about the direction of progress and the effect of that on raising the potential population density and the productive powers of labor, that is the value which can be measured by credit uttered from a national bank of a sovereign government to actually bring that into being. And it's that process which gives value to what we call money.
Mm.
That's kind of a short answer, but I think it'll be fun, in this series to do. People to take up that question of Hamilton and LaRouche's elaboration on it.
Yeah, I mean, especially at the end of your presentation when you kind of proposed that we imagine the hypothetical scenario where all of the governments in the world were actually working together working on their own within themselves with the intention of actually applying that principle of development, which is also survival, right? Like if all of the governments in the world were actually functioning in a way where the people were deliberating and working to survive and develop, it's when you said that it's a quite jarring thing to imagine, because it's so, particularly I think in the United States, just so completely foreign to anything that we can empirically associate with almost any level of our government at this point. Like the debates about spending and things like that. The Republicans think you should take more debt and whatever it is, it doesn't make any sense. It's all this like weird argument that doesn't make any sense. And that idea of value coming from the future, it just seems to me so clearly a resolution to the kind of complete breakdown that is currently occurring.
Jason has a good polemic on value. It says like, can we all agree that like a nail or like a screw costs like 5 cents, 10 cents, whatever, right? Okay. What is the value of that nail if it's used to make a bed? Is it still the same? Right?
Yeah.
Can't sleep on a nail.
Don't want to sleep in that.
Okay. And then like, what if that bed is used at a whorehouse? Does the nail still have the same value?
Depending on your morality, I guess.
What if it's used to build a rocket ship? Does it still have the same value?
a road.
I don't know. A rocket ship that's been nailed together. I don't know. I don't have very much value.
Or what if that's the bet of the chief science, the chief scientist at NASA who's making that happen?
There you go.
It's still a nail, though.
Yeah, but what's it being used for?
But that's like its value. Like the value is still the nail. And it comes together with all the other things that you value, like the other parts of the rocket, and then your own ingenuity, like to put it together. But I don't know. I kind of see it like as a similar argument where like a knife could be used to make a delicious meal or possibly murder somebody. Like what is the value of the knife? I think it's still a knife. I think physically it's still a knife, and there was value exerted by the person making the knife, by like all the cost that went in, like the labor that went into making the knife. Like that value is set no matter what comes after that.
But the cost is set.
Well,
The
yeah,
value is set.
the cost is set. But then, I think it just, it goes down to like the individual, like how they, like you said, they can do something good with it or do something bad with it.
But you would
But it's
agree.
still a nail.
You would agree that the value is different in each case, right? If the nail was used for something productive as opposed to something else.
I guess what I'm trying to say is like either way, if the nail was used for a bed in a homeless shelter or a bed in a whorehouse, I wouldn't be opposed to the nail being made. The person making the nail, and like that happening. Like I wouldn't. In terms of making the nail, I don't think I would think that far ahead. In terms of something like nuclear power, that's something that I would think way far ahead. Like, okay, if this is something that can be used for like such evil, like how do we make sure that it doesn't? But for a nail, I think for something like that, it's like how can I possibly be thinking about the future that much? Like at a certain point. So I think there's certain things that maybe you give that much more thought to about how does this, like where's this future headed, and is it in positive directions for our society? Or maybe I just think different. I don't know. Sorry. That was my I wasn't trying to push back. I was just trying to, I guess, elaborate on the analogy more. My mind is different. I feel like I kind of just the wrong response.
No, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to have tension. I don't think there is any tension though.
No, there's no tension. No, it's actually good because now I'm never looking at a nail the same way. I come across them all the time. And now, where were you made?
Where are you?
What is your purpose?
Is it going to be used to
Yeah.
nail together an F-16 fighter jet that's going to be flown over? Some
Why do you think fighter jets and rocket ships are just nailed together? They're not.
or the sheet
Well, the
metal?
ones
I
that are
don't know.
sending
Whatever.
great
You get what I'm saying.
Rivets.
You get what I'm saying. Anyway, we're coming up on time here, so now's the time if there's any pressing questions. Otherwise, we can.
I guess I have one more question. So it seems like the philosophy of LaRouche is oriented towards and thinks that it isn't a penultimate good, right? To develop and to progress and continuously grow. How would he or did he, would you say, respond to people that were ambivalent or kind of concerned about the prospect of infinite growth? Because I could see people having reservations, not out of Malthusianism per se, but just out of a kind of more conservative outlook on how to conduct oneself in life.
Some more honest people.
Yeah,
versus anti-human.
Not empire, population management thinking, but just I don't need to go to the moon. I can live a simple life,
You don't know you need to go to the moon.
Yeah. Well, how do you relate or convince somebody that is of that more conservative but earnest mindset that this is the correct way to orient oneself towards society and for society to orient itself?
It's a good question. I think part of it is just the really fun discussion and debate over what it is to be human. And from that standpoint, what is our assigned role? What is the universe need us to do? It should be provocative that when we do make what are provably true discoveries, the effect is of our new powers, you could say, is that we can live longer lives with higher standards of living, and there can be more of us, and there's more leisure time for education and pursuit of, fun things like singing courses, so that's so interesting. What are we as a species? What should we be doing? I think for me that's the primary answer. Another more practical answer, really practical about it, is in about 5 billion-ish years, our sun's gonna go. This planet's not gonna be that livable anymore. So, maybe I'm happy here on Earth or something, but just what can we do to contribute to that future progress and happiness of all of the beautiful accomplishments of humankind? Not just like people for people's sake, and that we might put it in that way, but all the beautiful things that human beings can do.
I think back to 1968. This is the crew of Apollo 8. It's Christmas Eve. What's happening in 1968? Dr. King is shot. Bobby Kennedy is shot. JFK was shot 4 years earlier. Malcolm X is shot 4 years earlier. Vietnam is like raging on. Everything sucks. And you have these people who are traveling to the moon, who are going to orbit the moon. It's Bill Anders, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman. And it's Christmas Eve. And around the world, television sets glowed with the broadcast. 1 in 4 people on Earth, roughly 1 billion people, spread among 64 countries, listened to the transmission. Within 24 hours, recorded broadcasts of the address from the moon reached people in another 30 countries. Audiences in North and South America, as well as Europe, tuned in live to the recently launched Intelsat 3 satellite. Comsat put the satellite operation a week ahead of schedule so that international audiences could follow the flight. So what happened was, it's Christmas Eve, it's Apollo 8, they're orbiting the moon, the world's a mess, and yet 1 billion people tune in to listen to these astronauts recite the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And it ends with Frank Borman saying, and God, and look, so they're up there and they're looking down on the earth and they're reading Genesis, and they end it with, and God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, and God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Why did 1 billion plus people decide to tune in 1968 to watch 4 people orbit the moon and, be told that, hey, God bless all of you on the good earth, when the earth is in turmoil? Because innately, whether we know it or not, we're inspired by these things. So I think that's why we do it.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We got 1 minute left. Okay. Anything you want to say?
No, let's come back next week.
Yeah. We're going to pick this up again next week with our 3rd class in the series. I want to thank people watching at home. My thingy says 561, but I think that might be inflated. It's probably more like 150 of you. Thank you. And I hope to see all of you here in the room again next week and more. And I don't have an end card, so I'm just going to hit end stream here until we're out.